Your first test is today because Secretary Schwab has provided us with some written comments as well. We're going to try to, as much as possible, be a paperless committee here, be frugal with taxpayer dollars. So we're not going to be doing the big briefing books and printing out every bill. It's going to be all going to be online. The other piece of information in front of you, we had to go back and look at the conferee rules because there was a lot of redundancy with our House rules. So we've pared them down to just the essentials, and you should have those, and those will be uploaded to the page as well for conferees. So with that, the first order of business is request for bill introductions. Does anybody have any bill introductions? Okay, Mr. Vice Chair.
We have a number of bill introductions that I would like to make today. The first is RS 0147, which is related to voter registration, requiring the Secretary of State to submit an annual report on voter registration procedures to the Legislature.
Are there any objections to introducing this bill? Okay, then without objections, the bill is introduced.
The second bill is RS 0150, which is an act relating to voter registration, requiring verification of the residential address for each registered voter and creating the crime of falsifying a residential address for the purpose of voter registration.
There any objections to this bill being introduced? Okay, seeing none, this bill is introduced.
The next bill is RS 0003. It's relating to advanced voting ballots, requiring the return of such ballots by 7 p.m. on the day of the election.
There are any objections to this bill being introduced? Seeing none, bill's introduced.
The next bill is RS 0004, relating to advanced voting ballots, regulating the use of remote ballot boxes for the return of such ballots.
There are any objections to this bill being introduced? Seeing none, the bill is introduced.
We have more. There's RS 0301, which is relating to advanced voting ballots, authorizing the Secretary of State to adopt rules and regulations for the use of remote ballot boxes.
Are there any objections to this bill being introduced? Seeing none, the bill is introduced.
Another bill, RS 0069, relating to voter identification, requiring post-secondary educational institutions to indicate when a student's identification issued by such institution cannot be used for voting purposes.
Are there any objections to this bill being introduced? Seeing none, the bill is introduced.
I also have RS 0072, relating to voter registration, requiring correction of voter registration list when notice is provided that a person is disqualified from juror service due to not being a U.S. citizen.
Are there any objections to this bill being introduced? Seeing none, bill is introduced.
And again, RS 0021, relating to advanced voting ballots, prohibiting third parties from mailing applications for such ballots to registered voters.
Are there any objections to this bill being introduced? Seeing none, the bill is introduced.
And the final one that I have is RS 0310, relating to requests for recounts of votes after an election, modifying the deadline for submitting such request.
Are there any objections to this bill being introduced? Seeing none, the bill is introduced. Are there any more bill introductions? Okay, seeing none, I will move to our second order of business, which is testimony from the Secretary of State's office. I'd like to thank Secretary of State Scott Schwab for joining us today and invite him to come to the podium and speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, after those bill introductions, we don't need that. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I look forward to working with you all on this committee and introductions, and I think, get more bills than days right now. So best of luck wishes to you. I do want to thank the committee, and some of you are all new to this committee. Some of you were here last year. We did some of the largest election security measures in over 10 years last year through the legislature, a lot of it with you all's help. And then we had turned around and had the highest voter turnout in a primary in the history of the state and the highest voter turnout in an election in the history of the state. And what we've proven is that when we do work together, we can increase voter security without compromising voter turnout. And so, you know, voter security is not a code word for voter suppression anymore. And we can still continue to go forward after the recounts that we showed that our clerks are getting it right, our poll workers, which I know there's poll workers on the committee, they know we get it right. And a lot of the folks that we encouraged 2 years ago in 2021, your name's not on a ballot this year. So you can all be a poll worker. And it's a good year to learn because a lot of times there's more bandwidth in these local elections. Often the ballots are shorter. We don't have a whole bunch of judges on the list, so it's a little bit easier. I would encourage you to go through the training, be a poll worker this August and this November. If you have friends that are accusing, you know, voter suppression or voter fraud, just say, you know, you got a great opportunity. Let's go be a poll worker. And there's a portal through our website. You can also go through your county election office, but you learn so much. And I know there's folks here on the committee that will testify a lot of the argument. It'll help you with your constituents. Because what happens is you get an argument or a complaint from your constituent about something that's wrong with the election system, and then you call our office, and then we answer the same questions all session long. Whereas if you've got a chance this summer and then again this fall to be a poll worker, you now can just answer it yourself because you're the person. And we let folks know you could be as young as 16 to be a poll worker. So we see a lot more parents with their teenage kids doing it together. If you have the luxury of Sedgwick County, you don't have to work the whole day, you can work the half day. I would like to see more counties do that, but it just depends on the amount of workers they recruit. So we do have a legislative agenda coming before you. We're trying to be as anemic as we can. We don't want to, again, we were able to have an agenda last year without compromising voter access. And that's, we want, when that voter goes to vote this year, or last year, I guess it's 2023 now, in 2022, even though we had this massive election security bill, the way folks voted, and it didn't affect voters at all, and clearly they felt fine to go vote without confusion. And we're real big on let's make it the less changes you make to the election system, you have less security compromises or administrative errors, and the less voter confusion you have. So if we do things more on the back end than on the front end, you get your policy and objectives that you want with the bills you often introduce, but it doesn't affect voters, it doesn't affect our clerks quite so much. And our clerks were under a lot of stress. There's political pressure. There was a new tax bill on tax statements that were coming out in the middle of the general election. And then one of the most important things you all did last year was in a close election, we did a larger sample of that post-election audit. And who knew that within months we would need that when you guys passed it. And we were so glad. It took the pressure off so many of our clerks because they could say, no, it wasn't fraud. And even there were some legislators that accused local election officials of fraud, and through the recounts, those arguments just kind of dissipated. So we think last year was a very big, successful year. And I'm not saying that because I got reelected, but that is kind of a nice little add-on to the thing. There's what we want to do, now that a lot of dyspepsia on voter fraud, voter suppression is kind of just dissipated, we have an opportunity to clean up some statutes that have been needed to be cleaned up for decades. It's a lot of words that are used in the 1800s and 1920s that we don't use words like that, so when people read it, they don't know. And if we can bring some consistency in the statute just along with terms, it just prevents us from getting sued, because if we get sued and we lose, you all got to pay for it. So we want to avoid that for you. We want to do some things to protect voters' data, and also make it a crime if you try to hack and manipulate the voter rolls. Like we said this 2 years ago, our biggest concern, now that we're critical infrastructure as election systems after the Obama administration, our biggest concern is foreign nationals and governments trying to erase and manipulate our voter list. It's very secure, and today, is it tomorrow? You know, we're constantly doing software updates and getting our briefings from Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and obviously General Weisar and the National Guard is a huge help to us over at the National Guard here in Topeka. But we want to make it a crime. It just gives us another tool in our belt, even if it's just an ambitious college kid that's just trying to create havoc. we need to let them know that it is a crime to try to mess with that. Not just a typical hacking crime, but it's an election crime. So use our office as a resource, and I'm going to wrap up take some questions here in a minute, if it's okay with you, Mr. Chairman. And then a lot of the nuts and bolts I give to Brian, because Brian's been in the office going back to the Breyer administration. I know he doesn't look that old, but he has forgotten about elections and what most people know. But use our office as a resource. If you do get those emails, you know, your county clerks can help. We're here to help. You're going to see Whitney and Clay around quite a bit. Lydia, who's also moving more into legislative affairs as we have more ground we need to cover, just to try to make sure people understand what is and what is not. And then also, let me go to my notes to make sure I'm not running off the rails here. Yeah, in a legislative intent, and we ask both sides of this, we're not the policymakers. We've been consistent for years, like on the 3-day grace period on mail ballots. Should be 2, should be 4, should be 0. That's policy. But last year there was an amendment, I think it was across Rotunda, just to move deadlines. Well, that becomes problematic because now clerks have to work on a weekend and they have to hire overtime employees to come in 2 days in a row, and a lot of county clerks don't have that budget. So when it comes to things like that, work with Whitney and Clay, and maybe we can help you meet your objective without crashing the system. And so they're here to serve you and help, and obviously we're all here to serve the state of Kansas. I think we'd all do it together. I'm really not concerned. I think with the way things came to be in 2022, I think a lot of the rumors that were pretty nefarious were easily disproven. And we've shown that, you know, the policy that comes out of this body is often a winning policy. We just have to work together. And we have a history of that, and I see no reason for that to change now. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions. I'll answer what I can. After the last few days, my feet are tired, so I'll do the best I can. If not, I might phone a friend.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. So before I open it to questions, I will say that I echo what the Secretary said. His team over there is incredible. You know, when I first got to the Elections Committee last term, the first thing I did, even before I got sworn in, was go over and talk to him, and they gave me kind of a Sermon on the Mount in elections. So if you have questions, I absolutely encourage you to talk to his team because they're top notch. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Representative Berquist.
Follow-up comment on that. During the firestorm of murmurings and political year talk, to get election laws through was a challenge, but it was well handled through you and through others that helped us to get it through, and we appreciate it so much. And we're glad to be a team for the state. Maybe policy differences change, but when it comes down to it, we're glad to be part of the team.
Thank you, Representative. I appreciate that.
Any other questions for the Secretary?
Yeah, Secretary Schwab, just for the record, you know, we did have a lot of requests for recounts, like, I mean, hand recounts in 2022, I think both maybe August, not so much in November. And can you kind of summarize for the committee, I mean, what actually happened when committee clerks actually had to literally hand count ballots? I mean, what was the result?
Mr. Vice Chairman, I really appreciate that question because a lot of folks, this is where it goes to being a volunteer in elections. You think, oh, they're just, you know, processing driver's license and letting people vote. It's very complex because of security measures. So a lot of folks say, why don't you just drop your ballot off at the clerk's office? Well, there's a chain of custody. I can't just say, here, hand this and turn it in for me, because there's a chain of custody. Recounts, it is, and I always liken it, remember we were kids and you play war and you had the red deck of cards your grandma brought from the casino and the blue deck of cards they brought from the casino with a hole going through the middle, and you mix them up and then you deal them out, then you got to separate them. Here's the blue ones, here's the red ones. A recount does not work like that at all. You have to bring people from the community and you bring them in, and this is the way our audit process works as well. They got to be separate parties, can't be everybody of one party. The clerk does not recount. Someone holds up the ballot and they say, do we all agree what this ballot says? Yes, there's one. We had hours statewide, and 61% of the ballots in value them both were recounted. That's not including the treasurer's office. There was a house that was recounted as well. Some folks ask me, well, how come there was a 2-vote difference. Well, if it says to fill in the oval with this pen, and you bring a pencil out of your pocket and draw a line, people may disagree on how to interpret voter intent. And so sometimes when you do the recount, they're like, hey, we're going to count that as a no vote. Whereas maybe the Board of Canvassers said, no, that's not a no vote. We don't know what that could be an errant mark. So there's always a human subjectivity that comes with these things. And that's why we have poll judges. And that's why we have the Board of Canvassers, so that can be somewhat of a consensus to understand. It's very clear in statute that the goal of an election is to find out who the winner is. So if one vote didn't count because somebody ruled it out, it only becomes seismic if it would have changed the result. But these hand counts, which we've never seen anything in state history like this, it's a heavy lift. I appreciate that question, because your county was one of them, correct? It's not a small county. Hutchinson is bigger than Hayes, to put it in perspective. Reno County is not a small county, and it's one of the top 15, I believe, in population. And so to go through that many votes, when you have that many voters and a record turnout, it was almost equal to a presidential election. And to show they got it right the first time, I love our poll workers. I don't ask what party they are. Most of the clerks don't even know what the registration is. I kind of guessed by where they live and what the typical voter registration is of the county. But I'm going to tell you, they did a great job. And they're not all Republican. They're not all Democrat. They all just work together. And so I really appreciate the question, because it was a heavy lift. And they did it while also having to verify signatures for a write-in gubernatorial candidate. They were having to put out tax notices. And some of them were having multiple recounts, not just the one. Oh, by the way, the Board of Canvassers is meeting next week. We got a bunch of provisionals, too. I'm very proud of our election officials. They deserve medals.
Any other questions for the Secretary? Okay, seeing none, I believe you brought somebody with you.
I did. Brian, of course, he's really good at this side of stuff, and his time to shine. He's our elections director. He's the one who the clerks lean on, and a lot of times county attorneys lean on. Brian's good with the numbers, so I'm going to let him go over the numbers with you about this election. And if you've ever followed these, which you got to be a little bit more left brain than I am, and I still follow them quite a bit, it's pretty impressive what we were able to do in this state with a heavy workload. So, Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Chairman Proctor, members of the committee. I do have quite a few numbers to read you. I apologize that I did not provide that in writing, so with your permission, I will follow up next week with maybe a one-page primer that will give you all the numbers I'm going to say so that you don't have to memorize them as I rattle off quite a bit. So,
please do.
Thank you. All right. Again, my name is Brian Caskey. I'm the Director of Elections for the state of Kansas. And I want to share some details from the 2022 election, which is truly a historic election in the history of this state. I'm going to start first with the primary election. In the primary election, we had 939,371 people cast a ballot. Over 900,000 people cast a ballot in a primary election. This is by far the most votes in a primary election in the history of this state. The previous high was 530,000. 400,000 more people voted in this primary than any primary ever. To me, I get chills when I talk about this. I've done this a long time. That is earth-shattering, and I credit all of you and the citizens of this state for doing that. Like I said, the previous high was 530,000. That was way back in 1996. This is approximately 48% of all registered voters. That is the highest percentage in the last 30 years. Prior to that, and why 30 years is important, that was the passage of the National Voter Registration Act by the U.S. Congress, and since then our voter rolls have been inflated, so we haven't seen a percentage like that since the passage of NVRA. We had 320,000 people cast a ballot prior to Election Day. That is also an all-time record, beating even the COVID year of 2020. We had more people vote in advance even than the COVID year in 2020. Again, more than ever in the history of this state. We had the most people registered to vote in the history of this state, 1.95 million. And so I'm just going to say it over and over again. The primary election was unprecedented. With that, after Election Day, we did a post-election audit. In the primary election, we audited the constitutional amendment, one statewide race, one legislative race, and one county race, in every single county. The purpose of the audit is to randomly select precincts in every county, have every ballot in that precinct counted by hand, and compare with a machine count. And every one of the 105 counties, in every race, every ballot was accounted for. In addition, as Secretary Schwab talked about, we had a close election audit. Due to the state treasurer's race for the Republican nomination, we had this audit provision kicked in. So in those counties, in all the counties, we audited an additional 10% of precincts across the state just for state treasurer on the Republican side. Again, in every county, every ballot was accounted for. At the conclusion of that audit, 3 recounts were requested. One for Kansas House of Representatives District 118, one for Republican State Treasurer, and one for the Constitutional Amendment. In total, 573,748 ballots were counted by hand because of the audit. To put that in perspective, as I talked about earlier, the previous high in a primary election was 530,000. Just in this audit, we counted more ballots by hand than had ever been cast in any previous primary election. So we counted by hand 573,000 ballots. The difference between the hand count and the machine count was 66. 66 out of 573,000. And in every one of those 66, there was a mark on the ballot that the board determined counted or didn't count, and the machine made a different decision. In every single one, there was a mark that was not misinterpreted, but a different interpretation between human eyes and a machine eye. As the secretary said, you know, your instructions to darken in the oval, not everyone does that. Every one of those 66 instances, the board made a decision that that should count when the machine did not. 66 out of 573,000. I consider that a truly remarkable experience. This is also the first time in the history of our state that a constitutional amendment was the subject of a recount. So just something else for the record books. So that kind of wraps up the primary. In the general, a lot of the same things. Over 1 million people cast a ballot in the 2020 general election. When we look at general election results, we always compare gubernatorial elections with gubernatorial elections. Presidential are always higher. So although this is not the highest vote we've ever had, is the second highest number of people we've ever had cast a ballot for governor. The previous record was the last governor election in 2018. That had just over 1.06 million, so we were a little bit behind that. This was 51% of the registered voters, and this percentage is consistent with governor turnout in the last 20 years, excuse me. We had 410,000 people cast a ballot in advance. This is approximately 6,000 people less than what happened in 2020 during the pandemic. And this is about 41% of all votes cast were done prior to Election Day. Again, every county successfully completed a post-election audit where every ballot in every county was accounted for. There were no recounts requested in the 2022 general election. And then I just want to echo something Secretary Schwab said, is to acknowledge the hard work and dedication of 105 county election officials, the hundreds of staff that they have, and the thousands of board workers that they hire on Election Day. With the numbers that we saw in 2022, along with the security provisions and the environment, I truly believe that the 2022 general and primary elections were a resounding success. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions for Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question. Do you have any kind of data on the reason why people do mail-in ballots? Like, is it convenience? Is it health? Is it work? Is it?
I would say anecdotally, it's all of the above. We have not conducted a survey of voter behavior to ask the voters that question, but anecdotally, all of those things I've heard and several others.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a question, just sort of the unprecedented surge in voters in Kansas here this year, particularly in the primary, that in some states, they will blame a surge in votes as to why everything's delayed and it takes them a couple days or a week or more, to get all their votes together. But in Kansas, that didn't seem to be much of a problem. I mean, is it just good system? I mean, why we can accommodate huge turnouts and small turnouts and it doesn't break the system? I mean, what's the secret sauce?
There's not a secret sauce. I will attribute it to the hard work of the 105 county election officers. They actually count the ballots and report it to us. And so they did an outstanding job. I believe that we have a very good system in place. The legislature should be proud of the system that we have. Secretary Schwab, we have an amazing team. So I think it's all those. And I will also credit maybe a little help from above.
Any other questions? So I've actually got a question. You talked a little bit, you said it and you moved on, and I'd like you to expand on it. You talked about how, since the Voting Rights Act, the voter rolls have become inflated. Could you talk about that, why that is, and what are the mechanisms for fixing it?
Absolutely. So in 1993, the federal Congress passed the Motor Voter Bill, which created enhanced opportunities to register to vote. At the same time, it limited the amount of ways that names could be removed from the voter registration list. And so since that time, in every state, Kansas included, the voter registration rolls just continually grow larger and larger because you can only remove someone for a handful of specific reasons. Prior to that passage, a county could remove a registered voter for not voting. That was taken away, which is one of the biggest reasons why the rolls keep increasing. So what we do today is we do a variety of things. Every week we do a check with the Department of Vital Statistics on everyone who's passed away. Every year we do a check with the National Social Security Administration. We get their master death list, and so we do a check looking for people who have deceased outside the state of Kansas. Every day, county election officers are looking at online obituary notices. So from a death perspective, that's what we're doing. We have a weekly check with the Kansas Department of Corrections on everyone who's convicted of a felony. So every week we're getting notifications of those and removing them from the voter registration list. For persons convicted of a felony outside the U.S., if it's through the U.S. court system, each of the U.S. attorney's offices send us regular notices on that. For people who move, every year we do a comparison of our voter registration list with the U.S. Postal Service National Change of Address Program. So if you've moved in the last 3 years and filed that with the U.S. Post Office, we're going to catch that, and then we will send you a notice. But you have to respond to the notice for us to update the voter registration list. And when I say us, I really mean the county election officers. It's not the Secretary of State, but I apologize for that wording. But a lot of this is dependent on the voter actually responding. If they don't, then we will have a little bit of dead weight. And so we're constantly looking at ways to improve that. I feel quite certain that our office would love to have a further conversation on this and see if there are additional ways that we can do to improve that.
Representative Berquist.
Yes, thank you. Most of us go out and when we're in the campaign mode or when we're just talking with our constituents, encouraging them to register to vote, encouraging them to vote. The excitement is in this year that there was so many people that registered to vote and became additional voters. Is the data available, the demographics of those new registered voters available yet in the system?
So we do have all that information within our voter registration database. You can purchase that from our office. We have some demographic information, mostly gender and age. We don't have anything on any type of ethnicity or origin, but we do have mostly age and gender. We do have that.
Is what I was thinking.
Yes, we do have that. You bet.
Any other questions? Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a question, and this goes, and I presume you're conversant with, I think this came from your office or from Schwab and the SOS office, but the on-election equipment, as far as state law requires all ballot marking devices to produce a voter-verified, paper ballot. And so is that Is that 100% at this point, or are there still old machines grandfathered in that don't have to do that, or are we at a 100% level with all machines produce, a paper ballot for audit?
Sure. In the 2022 election, both elections, every county had, every voter cast a ballot that produced a paper trail, either a piece of paper or a piece of paper produced by a ballot marking device that was then read by an optical scan. So every single voter had a physical paper ballot on every vote.
I can follow up with that. And when you do the hand recounts, is it the case that you're actually counting that original ballot, or is it a copy of the ballot? Or I've heard some different stories on that. Can you clarify?
Sure. So counties can review the actual paper ballot, or if they have ballot images, some counties do, some do not, you can count the ballot image instead. And why counties do that is it's much more efficient in some cases to count the ballot image, primarily because when we do the audit, we are randomly selecting precincts. And so a county your size will have 50,000 ballots and they'll have 100 precincts. And the biggest part of that work is trying to find the right ballots that belong to that precinct. If you just use the paper, that's dozens of hours of time just to get to the point where you can count. If you use the ballot image, you can find those much more faster and more efficient. And so that's why sometimes counties will use the ballot image to do that count.
Any more questions? Okay, so I'd be remiss if I don't ask this question. I got about a gajillion, that's a rough number, of emails about an incident in Johnson County with a ballot marking device where the button the person was pushing was not marking the correct voter on the paper ballot. I'd like, if you need to bring somebody else up to talk about it, that's fine, but could you talk about that just for the record so everybody watching at home can see it?
Absolutely. I am going to talk to Secretary Schwab because, just give me just a minute, okay?
So there was, and we're going to work with the vendor to kind of change the way that works. If you look at it, a lot of the voting machines, you see the name and there's a box. Because you're used to when you vote, there's a box, you put a check. But these machines, you're not supposed to hit the box, you're supposed to hit the name. So you're certain that you're voting for a person. When they hit the box, it wasn't registering right. But if they hit the name, it was. So we're just working with the vendor to get rid of the box and hit the name. It's really very easy. There were some calibration issues, which we're going to talk to the vendor. So at the end of every vote that was cast, there was a piece of paper to verify that voter's vote was their intent. But there was calibration. So it's like, I'm hitting this, it's not working. Okay, please hold. They'd take the machine, set off the side, come over to this machine, they just recalibrate the machine, it would be fine. Those are taught, it's just technology, but at the end of the day, I still like our system because here's why. I hear a lot of folks say, well, why not just do paper? You can't hack paper. You can burn it, you can spill coffee on it, you can blow it up in a terrorist attack. And it was a situation, one of the reasons why we went to voting machines is because early on in the 1900s, places like Chicago, someone would just go to vote for Representative Howerton. But they didn't fill out the judges. Those judges filled it out for you. Whereas the ballot marking devices we have now, if you say, I don't know who these judges are, I'm not going to vote, you can't exactly go back and fill that out illegally for the voter. And so it makes it a lot more pure of a system, but you still have paper. The paper is the ballot. It is what's counted. But on the back, there's also a stick just so that they can upload, so we can provide you all results election night, because I know by 12 o'clock at night, if the counties aren't reporting, my phone's blowing up from y'all. And so it's to give you results so you at least have a temperature of where the election's going. And then also there's an image of the ballot. So if someone does destroy the paper, all those votes aren't just gone. Those people's votes are still counted.
Representative Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the 66 ballots that were inaccurate on the audit, you said they had some kind of marking on them. So how were those handwritten ballots, like mail-in ballots, or how?
No,
ballots were-
well, they may have been some. So, and that wasn't necessarily the audit, that was the recount. And yeah, and we want to be clear with those because the recount was everything, the audit was a sample. A lot of times, and we find out, people will mismark their ballot. And sometimes they scribble out what they thought they voted for, and instead of asking for a clean ballot and destroying the one they scribbled, they just put it in the tabulator, and then it just may not be read right. And so we always tell votes, your ballot is your responsibility. Treat it like cash. Make sure you account it for. If you think you have a 5, make sure it's a 5 and not a 1. You know, it is your responsibility to make sure your vote gets in counted right. As a matter of fact, we've gone so far as our administration that if you do an advance mail ballot, you fill in the application, you go to our elections tab at our website, you can see if they got the application, you can see if they sent you the ballot, and you can see if the county received your ballot. These are things, again, it's your responsibility. If it's getting to be 5 days before the election and you know you mailed your ballot and they don't have it, it's time to make a phone call to that county election office.
So, on follow-up, so that wasn't those ballots were not voted on election day at a machine?
They may have. They may have.
How would those get marks on it?
Okay, so not all counties are on the Sedgwick system. Some of them have different systems where your ballot is almost like your ACT test that you took back in the day. It has the names, and you circle the oval next to the name you want to vote for. Well, if I just go, what are you voting for? Especially if it's a real big mark and you hit both candidates. That's how, now it goes to the human interpreter to see how that ballot should be interpreted.
Any other questions? Representative Howe.
Thank you, Chairman. I apologize because this isn't exactly a question, but I just wanted to say that while you're talking to the vendors, I would be curious to know, or just ask it was discussed and considered about using a stylus, having an attached stylus. I know that I have a condition that makes me have cold hands a lot, and even my iPhone does not recognize me until I warm my hands up. It thinks I'm not a human being. And so I actually had that problem during the primary, and I just reached in my purse and used my pen with the stylus on the end, and the machine recognized it right away when it wasn't recognizing my finger touching the screen. So I understand during COVID we all needed individual separate ones, but something like that might be something to just at least consider. That's all I'm suggesting.
I appreciate that. First off, would you start serving as a poll worker? I mean, can you, actually, I'll let you tell you, sorry, since what age?
I will, well, I'm not sure exactly how old I was when I started poll worker, but.
Teenager.
Yeah, well, probably.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that's a good idea. Obviously, during COVID, nobody wanted stickers to say I voted. So it was actually Sandy Tompkins, she does our budget, and she also handles HR in our office. It was her idea to say, well, just do a pin, and obviously we're getting baptized in federal cash. It wasn't a big lift, but trying to continue to buy. A lot of counties have some leftovers, so they're still using them. That's something we can review, because a lot of folks don't have that condition, but perhaps just having it offered at the county office level. I know some folks, like me, when I go to the hotel room, I don't touch the remote. It's been 20 years. I don't touch that thing. Some people would want to see a public stylus, but if it could be offered, that might be affordable, and we could suggest that to the counties. So, and if a vendor wants to pay for that, we just have to check the law.
Any other questions? So one last one, if you need to bring Brian back up because it's kind of technical. When we were running the bill last year about voting machines not being connected to the internet, which you suggested, I got a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails about the information that gets downloaded to the machines when they're being set up or something like that. Could you or one of your team talk about what information gets put into those machines that is coming from the internet, and how you secure it to make sure that nothing nefarious is happening?
Yeah, so, and it's really interesting because people get confused between the poll book, the voting machine, and then the tabulator. And what kind of spacing do we call that again, Brian? Something spacing between each unit? I can't remember. CISA uses a term, it's some nerdy computer term, something spacing. So if you've used a voting machine, and if you don't have a voting machine, well, this is how it normally works. You go in, you give her a driver's license, and they verify that you're a qualified elector for that ballot. They'll have something that looks like a hotel room key on it. They escort you to the machine, put it in there, and give you instruction on how to use the machine and answer any questions you have. Your ballot is on that. That's not on the network. That's why they have to walk you and physically put it in with their hands, because the poll book cannot talk to the machine, or else I'd be able to see how y'all voted. Nobody wants that. So then when you're done, it prints off a piece of paper so that you put it in the tabulator, because the tabulator can't talk to the machine. So the only thing that's on the network is the poll book, and here's the reason why, is you got to fill that data somehow. So it's on the network to provide the database for Election Day. And that was part of the Help America Vote Act that Congress passed after Bush v. Gore, is that if you move from Sedgwick County to Pottawatomie County, the moment you register to vote in Pottawatomie County and they put it in the system, you come off real time out of Sedgwick County. That requires a network to pull that off. But that never talks to a voting machine. The voting machine is manually programmed, and then the tabulator as well. And so we wanted that law just simply because after Bush v. Gore, Florida had so much problems with the media, they wanted their tabulators on a network to connect it, to talk to the Secretary of State's office, to populate the website faster so the press could get the returns faster. The press can wait. No offense if they're in the room, but they can wait. We would rather just have it done in more, and especially with the environment of people creating rumors about these things. And also, it'll never be, unless you guys pass another law, it's not legal to do it, and that also gives clerks cover.
Thank you. And then in the interest of kind of improving public confidence here, the other adjunct thing that is going around is about how you update the software on those vote machines and on the vote counters.
Yeah, so the vendor will do a release if there's a software update. Normally, you just buy new hardware. It's really not necessarily a software update, because it's not like this, that there's constantly new applications. The machine is the machine. Like your calculator doesn't get a software update. It gets the software it came with. If there's an update, most counties will have a third party address that, because once the vendor sold the machine, it's no longer their machine and they don't want them touching it. So they'll go through a third party.
Any other questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Forever? No. I'm holding you to it.
No, thank you, Secretary.
Thank you, members of the committee. Look forward to working for you. Looking forward to work with you this year. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that concludes the business today. Is there anything for the good of the order before we adjourn? Okay, seeing nothing, we are adjourned. Thank you.